The ATF agent standing in my driveway had the most bewildered expression I'd ever seen on a federal officer's face, and that was saying something considering the absurd situation that had brought him to my suburban Phoenix home on a Tuesday afternoon. I'm Blake Owens, a 34-year-old software engineer who works remotely for a tech company in California. I moved to the Pleasant Valley Estates development in Scottsdale, Arizona about 8 months ago, thinking the gated community would offer peace and quiet after years of apartment living in San Diego. The house was perfect, a 3-bedroom ranch style with a 2-car garage, desert landscaping, and enough space for my home office setup. What I hadn't counted on was the Homeowners Association president, a woman named Deborah Patterson, who made it her personal mission to monitor every single resident like we were all criminals waiting to commit our first offense. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to how this whole mess started. It began 3 weeks earlier when I had a gun safe delivered to my house. Nothing fancy, just a Liberty Colonial Series safe that weighed about 800 pounds and required professional installation. I'm a gun owner, completely legal, with my concealed carry permit and everything properly registered according to Arizona state law. I own 3 handguns and 2 rifles, all purchased through licensed dealers with background checks completed. The safe was actually a responsible purchase, something I'd been planning since moving in, because keeping firearms secure is just common sense. The delivery truck arrived on a Saturday morning around 9. 2 guys with a dolly and a lot of grunting managed to wheel the massive safe through my garage and into the spare bedroom I'd designated as my gunroom/storage area. The whole process took maybe 45 minutes, and I tipped the delivery guys well because I know that job isn't easy in Arizona heat, even in October. I didn't think anything of it. The safe was inside my house, not visible from the street, and frankly, none of anyone's business. But apparently, Deborah had been watching from her house 3 doors down like she always did. The first sign of trouble came 2 days later when I found a letter in my mailbox. Not delivered by the Postal Service, just stuck in there by hand. The HOA letterhead made my stomach sink before I even read the contents. "Dear Mr. Owens," it began in that passive-aggressive tone that HOA notices always seem to carry. "It has come to the attention of the Pleasant Valley Estates Homeowners Association that you recently had a large item delivered to your residence. As per Section 7.3 of the HOA bylaws, any deliveries requiring specialized equipment or potentially hazardous materials must be reported to the HOA board at least 72 hours in advance. Additionally, Section 9.1 requires disclosure of any items that may pose a risk to community safety or property values. Please contact the HOA office within 5 business days to discuss this matter and provide documentation regarding the nature of this delivery. Failure to comply may result in fines of up to $500 per day. Sincerely, Deborah Patterson, HOA President." I read the letter 3 times, my blood pressure rising with each pass. The HOA bylaws I'd received when purchasing the house were 147 pages long, and while I'd skimmed them, I certainly hadn't memorized every obscure clause. But more importantly, a gun safe in my own house had nothing to do with the HOA. It wasn't visible from outside, it didn't affect property values, and it definitely didn't require their permission. I decided to ignore the letter. Big mistake. The following week, Deborah showed up at my door. I was in the middle of a video conference call with my team when the doorbell rang insistently. 3 long presses that interrupted my train of thought. I muted my microphone and went to answer, figuring it was a package delivery. Instead, I found Deborah standing on my porch with her phone in hand, already recording. She was 52 according to the HOA directory, with short blonde hair styled in that aggressive soccer mom cut that screamed, "I want to speak to the manager." She wore a white polo shirt with the Pleasant Valley Estates logo embroidered on it and khaki capri pants with sensible sneakers. Her expression radiated barely contained outrage. "Mr. Owens," she said loudly before I could even greet her, "I'm here on official HOA business. You failed to respond to our notice regarding your unauthorized delivery. I need to inspect the item in question to determine if it violates community standards." "I'm working right now," I said, keeping my voice level. "And no, you can't come into my house to inspect my personal property. Section 12.4 of the bylaws grants the HOA board the right to inspect any property within the community if there's reasonable suspicion of a violation, she countered, holding up her phone to show she was still recording. Reasonable suspicion of what exactly? Having furniture delivered? Neighbors reported seeing a large safe being brought into your residence. We have concerns about what you're storing in there. The way she emphasized concerns made it clear she'd already decided I was doing something wrong. I took a deep breath, reminding myself that losing my temper would only make things worse. What I keep in my house is my business, Deborah. The safe is legal. It's inside my home, and it's not visible from the street or common areas. There's no HOA violation here. Her face flushed red. The bylaws clearly state, the bylaws don't override my constitutional rights or my property rights as a homeowner. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. I closed the door before she could respond, but I could hear her muttering angrily on my porch for another minute before she finally left. Through the window, I watched her stomp back to her white SUV, still holding her phone up like she was documenting a crime scene. That evening, I pulled out my copy of the HOA bylaws and actually read through them carefully. Section 7.3 did mention advance notice for deliveries, but it specifically referred to construction materials, swimming pool installations, or landscaping projects that would impact common areas or neighboring properties. A furniture delivery, which is essentially what a safe is, didn't fall under that category. Section 9.1 was about exterior modifications like satellite dishes, solar panels, or paint colors, not interior items. And Section 12.4, which Deborah had cited, allowed inspections only for violations visible from outside the property or for emergency situations like water leaks affecting other units. I drafted a formal response letter, citing each section and explaining why none of them applied to my situation. I kept it professional and factual, delivered it to the HOA office Dropbox the next morning, and hoped that would be the end of it. It wasn't. 3 days later, I received another letter, this one even more aggressive. Deborah claimed that multiple neighbors had expressed concerns about my safe and what I might be storing. She demanded I provide a complete inventory of the safe's contents, photographs of the interior, and proof that everything inside was legal. The letter threatened daily fines starting at $500 and escalating to $2,000 after the first week. This was getting ridiculous. I consulted with a real estate attorney named Marcus Chen, who specialized in HOA disputes. His office was in downtown Phoenix, a sleek high-rise with a view of the city sprawl. Marcus was in his early 40s, sharp-dressed in a gray suit, and he listened to my story with increasing amusement. "They want an inventory of your gun safe," he asked, tapping his pen on his desk. "That's impressively overreaching, even for an HOA. Can they actually do that?" "Absolutely not. The Fourth Amendment protects you from unreasonable searches, and that includes HOA boards who think they're law enforcement. The bylaws you showed me don't support their position at all. They're essentially making up requirements as they go." So what do? Write back, cite the Fourth Amendment, and tell them to pound sand. Well, more professionally than that, but that's the gist. If they try to fine you, we'll fight it. Most likely they'll back down once they realize you're serious about your rights. I followed Marcus's advice and sent another letter, this one referencing my constitutional rights and making it clear I wouldn't be providing any information about the contents of my safe. I also mentioned that I'd consulted with an attorney and was prepared to take legal action if the harassment continued. For about a week, things were quiet. I actually started to relax, thinking maybe Deborah had finally gotten the message. Then came the Tuesday that changed everything. I was working in my home office, debugging some code that had been giving me trouble all morning, when I heard a knock at my door. Not a doorbell ring, but the distinctive hard knock of someone used to demanding attention. I saved my work and went to answer, expecting maybe a package that wouldn't fit in my mailbox. Instead, I found a man in his mid-30s wearing business-casual clothes, a badge hanging from a lanyard around his neck, standing next to Deborah on my porch. She had this triumphant look on her face that immediately set off alarm bells. "Blake Owens?" the man asked. "That's me." "I'm Special Agent David Rodriguez with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. I received a report about firearms at this residence, and I'd like to ask you some questions." My heart rate spiked, but I kept my expression neutral. What kind of report? He glanced at Deborah, who looked ready to burst with vindication. Mrs. Patterson here filed a complaint claiming you have an arsenal of illegal weapons stored on the property. She expressed concerns about community safety. An arsenal, I repeated flatly. She told you I have an arsenal. The report mentioned a large gun safe and suspicious behavior, suggesting possible illegal firearms trafficking. I had to laugh at that. I couldn't help it. The absurdity of the situation was just too much. Here was this HOA president so obsessed with controlling her little kingdom that she'd actually called the ATF on a law-abiding gun owner just because I wouldn't let her inspect my property. "Come in," I said to Agent Rodriguez, stepping aside. "I'm happy to show you everything. Deborah, you stay outside." "I have a right to be present for this inspection," she protested. "No, you don't," Agent Rodriguez said firmly. "This is a federal investigation, not an HOA matter. Please wait out here, Mrs. Patterson." The look on her face was almost worth all the hassle. I led Agent Rodriguez inside, giving him a quick tour of my house. It was clean, organized, nothing suspicious anywhere. My home office had my computer set up, some books, and my Arizona State University diploma on the wall. The living room was furnished simply with a couch, TV, and some framed landscape photos I'd taken hiking in Sedona. "The safe is in the spare bedroom," I said, leading him down the hall. "I have 3 handguns and 2 rifles, all legally purchased. I have my concealed carry permit, all my registration paperwork, and receipts from the dealers I bought them from." I opened the door to the room where the safe sat against the far wall. It was a nice piece of equipment, black with gold trim, the Liberty logo prominent on the door. I spun the combination lock and pulled the heavy door open, revealing the interior. The safe was organized exactly how you'd expect a responsible gun owner's safe to be. 2 rifles in the rack on the left side, a Remington 700 hunting rifle, and an AR-15 that I'd bought for target shooting. 3 handguns in the foam-lined drawer, 2 Glocks and a Sig Sauer, boxes of ammunition stored separately on the bottom shelf, all commercial brands. My important documents were in a fireproof box on the top shelf, birth certificate, passport, that kind of thing. Some cash in an envelope, maybe $2,000. A watch that had been my grandfather's. Nothing illegal, nothing even remotely suspicious. Agent Rodriguez examined everything methodically. He checked the serial numbers on all 5 firearms against some database on his phone. He looked at my paperwork, my concealed carry permit, the bills of sale from the gun shops. He even checked my ammunition to make sure there was nothing armor-piercing or otherwise restricted. After about 20 minutes, he straightened up and looked at me with that same bewildered expression I mentioned at the beginning of this story. "Mr. Owens, everything here is completely legal. You have fewer guns than most collectors I've dealt with, all properly registered, all legally obtained. Your safe is actually more secure than required by any law. There's absolutely nothing wrong here." "I know," I said. "I'm a responsible gun owner who wanted to store his firearms safely. That's literally the extent of my criminal activity." "Mrs. Patterson claimed you had dozens of weapons, possible illegal modifications, and that you were running some kind of trafficking operation." "Mrs. Patterson is the HOA president who's angry that I wouldn't let her inspect my property without cause. This is retaliation, because I stood up for my rights." Agent Rodriguez sighed heavily. "I had a feeling it might be something like that. We get false reports sometimes, usually from people with personal grudges. But filing a false report with the ATF is a serious matter. It wastes federal resources and can have legal consequences for the person who filed it." "What happens now?" "I'll file my report stating that the complaint was unfounded and that you're in full compliance with all federal firearms laws. I'll also note in my report that the complaint appears to have been filed in bad faith. The Bureau takes false reports seriously, especially when they're used as harassment." We walked back to the front door together, where Deborah was pacing on my porch like a caged animal. She immediately rushed over when she saw us. "Well," she demanded, "how many illegal weapons did you find? Is he going to be arrested?" Agent Rodriguez turned to face her with an expression of professional displeasure. "Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Owens has 5 legally owned firearms stored in a secure safe. Everything is properly registered and in full compliance with federal and state law. Owning a gun safe isn't a crime. In fact, it's what we encourage all gun owners to do. Her face went through a series of expressions, from confusion to anger to indignation. But he has a safe, a huge safe. Why would someone need a safe that big unless they're hiding something illegal? People use safes to store valuables, important documents, and firearms securely. There's nothing illegal or even unusual about it. What is unusual is filing a false report with a federal agency. That's actually a crime. Mrs. Patterson, filing a false report with the ATF can result in fines and even imprisonment. The color drained from her face. False report? I was concerned about community safety. You claimed Mr. Owens had an arsenal of illegal weapons and was trafficking firearms. Neither of those things is true. You also claimed suspicious behavior, which you couldn't specify when I asked you for details earlier. This appears to be a personal dispute that you tried to escalate by involving federal law enforcement. I have a right to report safety concerns. You have a right to report genuine concerns, yes, but making demonstrably false claims is a different matter entirely. I'll be noting in my report that this complaint appears to have been filed in bad faith as part of a harassment campaign related to an HOA dispute. Deborah looked like she wanted to argue more, but Agent Rodriguez's stern expression apparently convinced her to stop talking. She turned to me instead, her voice sharp. This isn't over, Mr. Owens. You still violated HOA bylaws, and you'll still be facing fines. Actually, Agent Rodriguez interjected, I'd strongly advise against any further harassment of Mr. Owens, Mrs. Patterson. If he files a complaint about this incident, you could face legal consequences. Filing false federal reports is a serious matter. He handed me his card before leaving. If you have any more problems, give me a call. I'll be happy to provide a statement about the false report if you need it for legal action. After Agent Rodriguez drove away in his unmarked sedan, Deborah stood on my driveway for a long moment, clearly trying to decide what to say. Finally, she just stormed off to her SUV without another word, peeling out of my driveway with unnecessary aggression. I called Marcus Chen immediately and told him everything that had happened. He was simultaneously amused and appalled. She called the ATF? That's a new level of HOA crazy, and I've seen a lot of crazy. The agent said she could face legal consequences for filing a false report. She absolutely could. But more importantly for your situation, this is clear evidence of harassment. We can use this to shut down any HOA fines or actions against you. In fact, we might want to consider going on the offensive here. What do you mean? Sue the HOA and Deborah personally for harassment. You have documentation of repeated baseless accusations, threats of illegal fines, and now a false federal report. That's a pattern of behavior that goes beyond normal HOA business. It's targeted harassment, and Arizona law protects homeowners from that. I thought about it. Part of me just wanted to be left alone, to move on with my life and forget this whole mess. But another part of me was angry. Deborah had crossed a serious line by involving federal law enforcement in a petty HOA dispute. She'd wasted Agent Rodriguez's time, put me through unnecessary stress, and tried to paint me as a criminal just because I wouldn't bow to her authority. Let's do it, I said. What do we need to get started? Over the next few days, Marcus and I built our case. I documented every interaction with Deborah, every threatening letter from the HOA, every violation notice that had no legal basis. Agent Rodriguez provided a written statement confirming that the complaint filed against me was unfounded and appeared to be made in bad faith. We pulled the HOA bylaws and highlighted every section that Deborah had misrepresented or outright lied about. We also discovered something interesting. When I'd purchased my house, I'd been given what was supposedly the complete set of HOA bylaws. But when Marcus subpoenaed the official documents from the management company that handled Pleasant Valley Estates, we found that several sections Deborah had cited in her letters didn't actually exist. She'd literally made up bylaw sections to justify her demands. That's fraud, Marcus explained when he showed me the discrepancies. She created fake rules to threaten you with fake fines. That's not just overreach, that's actual criminal fraud. How is that even possible? Don't the bylaws have to be filed officially? They do, and the real bylaws are filed with the county. But most homeowners never check. They just trust that the HOA is citing the rules correctly. Deborah was counting on you not calling her bluff. We filed our lawsuit on a Thursday morning. The complaint named both the Pleasant Valley Estates HOA and Deborah Patterson personally, seeking damages for harassment, emotional distress, defamation, and fraud. We asked for $50,000 in compensatory damages, plus attorney fees, plus an injunction preventing the HOA from taking any further action against me regarding the gun safe. The process server delivered the complaint to Deborah at her home that afternoon. According to the server, she had opened the door, seen the legal papers, and actually screamed before slamming the door in his face. He had had to leave the papers on her doorstep, which was legally sufficient service in Arizona. The HOA's response was swift, but not in the way I expected. 2 days after being served, I received a phone call from a man named Gerald Hutchins, who identified himself as the vice president of the HOA board. His voice was apologetic and cautious. "Mr. Owens, I want to apologize for what's happened. The rest of the board wasn't aware of the extent of Mrs. Patterson's actions regarding your property. When we learned that she'd filed a report with the ATF and had been misrepresenting our bylaws, we called an emergency board meeting. And, as of last night, Deborah Patterson is no longer the president of the Pleasant Valley Estates HOA. She's been removed from the board entirely. We've also voted to immediately cease all actions against you regarding your gun safe. There will be no fines, no further demands for inspection, nothing. We want to resolve this situation peacefully if possible." I appreciated the apology, but I wasn't ready to just drop everything. "What about the false bylaw sections she cited, and the harassment? We're conducting a full audit of all correspondence Mrs. Patterson sent on behalf of the HOA. We believe she acted independently and exceeded her authority in multiple cases, not just yours. Several other homeowners have come forward with similar complaints after learning about your lawsuit. We're prepared to make this right. I'm going to need more than just words, Mr. Hutchins. My attorney and I will expect a formal settlement offer in writing." "Absolutely. We'll have something to you within the week. And Mr. Owens, for what it's worth, I own guns too. What Deborah did was way out of line, both as an HOA president and as a human being. You had every right to secure your firearms properly." True to his word, a settlement offer arrived 5 days later. The HOA agreed to pay my attorney fees in full, issue a formal written apology, and amend the bylaws to explicitly prohibit board members from making inspection demands without genuine cause. They also offered $5,000 for my trouble, which Marcus advised me to accept. "You could probably get more if we went to trial, but trials are expensive and time-consuming. This is a solid settlement that accomplishes our main goals, clearing your name, establishing that the HOA was in the wrong, and preventing future harassment." I agreed to the settlement with one addition. I wanted the HOA to send a letter to every resident in Pleasant Valley Estates explaining what had happened, that I'd been falsely accused, that the bylaws had been misrepresented, and that Deborah had been removed from the board for her actions. I wanted everyone in the community to know I wasn't some gun-running criminal and that the HOA had admitted their mistake. The HOA agreed to that term, though Gerald Hutchins sounded pained when he called to confirm. "That letter is going to be embarrassing for us." "It should be," I replied. "What happened here was serious. Other homeowners need to know that the board will be held accountable when they overstep." The letter went out to all 237 households in Pleasant Valley Estates on a Monday afternoon. It was detailed and unflinching in its description of what Deborah had done, though it avoided using the word fraud at Marcus's advice. Within hours, my phone started buzzing with messages from neighbors I'd barely spoken to before. Some were apologetic, saying they had heard rumors about the ATF visit and had wondered what was going on. Others were supportive, fellow gun owners who were appalled at how I'd been treated. A few shared their own stories of conflict with Deborah, smaller incidents that hadn't risen to the level of lawsuits, but had been frustrating nonetheless. One neighbor, a retired Marine named Tom Sullivan who lived 2 streets over, stopped by in person to shake my hand. "I heard what happened, brother. Good for you for standing up to that woman. She tried to fine me last year because my garbage cans were visible from the street on a non-collection day. Turns out she made that rule up too. I just paid the $100 fine because I didn't know any better. You could probably get that money back now, I suggested. If she was making up rules for you too, the HOA might refund it. I might just do that. But mostly I wanted to say I'm glad someone finally called her on her nonsense. She's been terrorizing this neighborhood for 3 years. As word spread about the settlement and Deborah's removal, more stories emerged. She'd apparently tried to ban one family's teenage daughter from visiting because the girl had pink hair, claiming it violated community standards. She'd threatened another homeowner with fines for having solar panels installed, even though they'd gotten pre-approval from the Architectural Review Committee. She'd even tried to have someone's service dog banned, claiming it was too large and violated pet size restrictions that didn't actually exist in the bylaws. The more I learned, the more I realized I'd accidentally become the catalyst for a much-needed change in the community. People who'd been quietly suffering under Deborah's reign of petty tyranny were now speaking up, filing their own complaints with the board and demanding accountability. But the story wasn't quite finished. About 2 weeks after the settlement was finalized, I got another call from Agent Rodriguez. "Mr. Owens, I wanted to give you a heads up. We've decided to pursue charges against Deborah Patterson for filing a false report." I sat up straighter in my desk chair. Seriously? The U.S. Attorney's Office reviewed my report and the evidence you provided through your attorney. They believe this case meets the threshold for prosecution. Filing a false report with a federal law enforcement agency is a crime under Title 18, Section 1001 of the U.S. Code. Combined with the evidence that she fabricated HOA rules to harass you, they see a clear pattern of malicious behavior. What kind of charges is she looking at? Most likely a misdemeanor charge with potential fines and probation. It's rare for someone to get prison time for a false report unless it's part of a larger criminal conspiracy. But she'll have a federal conviction on her record. That's serious. I appreciate you letting me know. You did the right thing by standing your ground. People like Mrs. Patterson need to learn that they can't weaponize law enforcement for personal vendettas. And between you and me, the way you handled this, staying calm and going through proper legal channels, that's exactly what citizens should do when dealing with government overreach, even HOA government. The criminal case moved slowly through the federal system, as these things do. Deborah hired a lawyer, tried to argue that she'd had genuine concerns, but the evidence was overwhelming. The ATF report, the falsified bylaws, the pattern of harassment, my clean record and legal firearms ownership, it all painted a clear picture of malicious intent. 3 months after the initial incident, Deborah Patterson pleaded guilty to filing a false report with a federal agency. She was sentenced to 2 years of probation, 200 hours of community service, and a $5,000 fine. The judge also ordered her to write a formal apology letter to me, which arrived in my mailbox a week after sentencing. It was possibly the most grudging apology I'd ever read, full of passive voice constructions like mistakes were made and situations escalated. But at the end, there was one sentence that seemed genuine. I allowed my authority as HOA president to override my judgment and common sense, and I'm sorry for the harm that caused you. I didn't frame it or anything, but I did keep it in a file with all the other documentation from this saga. Sometimes you need reminders of lessons learned, both your own and other people's. Life in Pleasant Valley Estates improved dramatically after Deborah's removal. Gerald Hutchins became the new HOA president and ran things with a much lighter touch. The board adopted new policies limiting their authority to genuine community issues like maintaining common areas and enforcing basic property standards. No more made-up rules, no more harassment over personal choices that didn't affect anyone else. I actually got involved with the HOA myself, joining the Architectural Review Committee to help ensure future decisions were fair and based on actual regulations rather than personal preferences. It was kind of boring, reviewing requests for paint colors and fence installations, but it felt good to be part of making the community better. Tom Sullivan, the retired Marine, also joined the board as treasurer. We became good friends, sometimes hitting the shooting range together on weekends. He had an impressive collection of military surplus rifles and was teaching me about long-range precision shooting. The gun safe that had started this whole mess now just sat in my spare room, doing exactly what it was supposed to do, keeping my firearms secure. I'd added a fourth handgun to my collection, a classic 1911 that Tom had recommended, and I felt good knowing they were all stored safely and responsibly. About 6 months after everything settled, I was having a beer with Tom in my backyard when he asked me if I'd ever considered what might have happened if I'd just given in to Deborah's demands from the start. I thought about it at the time, I admitted. Part of me wanted to just show her the safe inventory and be done with it, but it was the principle of the thing. If I let her violate my rights over something small, where does it stop? That's the thing about rights, Tom said, tipping his beer bottle toward me. They don't mean much unless you're willing to defend them, even when it's uncomfortable or difficult. You did good, Blake. A lot of people would have folded. I had a good attorney and a federal agent who saw through her nonsense. I got lucky. Luck helps, but you still had to stand up for yourself first. And look what came of it. The whole neighborhood is better off now because you wouldn't back down from a bully with a clipboard. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the Arizona sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The desert landscape of Pleasant Valley Estates looked peaceful, almost idyllic. It was hard to believe this place had been the center of such drama just months earlier. I thought about everything that had happened, from that first threatening letter to Deborah's conviction, and realized Tom was right. Standing up to her had been scary and stressful, but it had been worth it. Not just for me, but for everyone else she'd been bullying. The HOA sent out its monthly newsletter a few days later, and buried in the announcements was a small note that made me smile. They were organizing a community safety seminar about gun ownership, storage, and Arizona firearms laws. Gerald Hutchins called to ask if I'd be willing to speak at it, maybe explain why gun safes are important and share my experience as a responsible gun owner. I think it would help, he said. Some people are scared of guns because they don't understand them. You could educate folks and maybe prevent future misunderstandings like what happened with Deborah. I agreed to do it, and the seminar ended up being surprisingly well attended. About 60 residents showed up at the community center, and I spoke for 20 minutes about gun safety, proper storage, and Arizona's laws regarding firearms ownership. A representative from the Scottsdale Police Department also spoke, emphasizing that legal gun ownership was a constitutional right and that responsible gun owners were an asset to community safety, not a threat. Several people approached me afterward with questions or comments. One woman admitted she'd been nervous about having gun owners in the neighborhood, but felt much better after learning about the regulations and safety measures people like me took. An older gentleman mentioned he'd been thinking about buying a gun for home defense and asked for recommendations on firearms courses and dealers. It was a positive experience that helped turn what had been a divisive issue into an educational opportunity. The whole situation with Deborah had been terrible while it was happening, but the aftermath actually brought the community closer together and opened up important conversations. Not everyone was thrilled with how things turned out, of course. Deborah's friends, the handful of other busybodies who'd supported her authoritarian approach to the HOA, were bitter about her removal and conviction. I'd occasionally see them glaring at me at community events or hear whispers when I walked past. But they didn't have any power anymore, and they knew better than to try anything after what had happened to Deborah. One afternoon, about 9 months after the whole situation had resolved, I was checking my mail when I noticed Deborah's house had a for sale sign in the yard. I wasn't surprised. Living in Pleasant Valley Estates after everything that had happened must have been uncomfortable for her, dealing with the judgment and knowing everyone saw her as the cautionary tale of HOA overreach. I didn't take any pleasure in her leaving. Despite everything she'd put me through, I didn't hate her. I felt sorry for her, honestly. She'd let a little bit of power go to her head and had made terrible decisions that cost her reputation, money, and peace of mind. It was a harsh lesson about the consequences of trying to control other people's lives. The house sold quickly to a young couple with 2 kids who seemed nice enough when I met them at a neighborhood barbecue. They asked about the HOA, clearly having heard stories, and I gave them an honest assessment. It's fine now. We had some issues in the past, but the current board is reasonable. Just follow the actual bylaws, be respectful of your neighbors, and you won't have any problems. We heard something about the previous president getting in trouble, the husband asked cautiously. That's all in the past. Let's just say the HOA learned some important lessons about respecting homeowners' rights. They seemed satisfied with that answer and didn't push for details. I appreciated that. I was ready to move on from being that guy who got the ATF called on him and just be a regular neighbor again. Work was going well, too. My company had been impressed with how I'd handled the legal situation, my boss commenting that it showed good judgment and backbone to stand up for myself through proper channels. They gave me a raise during my annual review, citing both my technical contributions and the leadership qualities I'd demonstrated. I used part of that raise to upgrade my home security system and install cameras around my property. Not because I was worried about Deborah specifically, but because the whole experience had made me more aware of the importance of documentation. If someone ever tried to make false accusations against me again, I'd have video evidence to refute their claims. The cameras came in handy sooner than expected, though not for anything dramatic. A delivery driver claimed he'd left a package at my door that I insisted had never arrived. The camera footage clearly showed he'd delivered it to the wrong address 3 houses down. Amazon refunded my order immediately when I provided the video evidence. I also started keeping detailed records of all my firearms maintenance, range visits, and ammunition purchases. It seemed excessive, but Agent Rodriguez had mentioned during one of our follow-up conversations that good record-keeping was the mark of a responsible gun owner. If anything ever got stolen, or if I ever needed to prove ownership for any reason, I'd have comprehensive documentation. The shooting hobby became a bigger part of my life after everything settled down. Tom and I joined a competitive shooting league at a range in East Phoenix, traveling together to monthly matches. I wasn't particularly good at first, but I enjoyed the challenge and the community of other shooters who took the sport seriously. At one match, I mentioned my story about the HOA and the ATF to a few other competitors during a break. Several of them had similar tales of conflicts with neighbors or local officials who didn't understand gun culture. One guy had been reported to the police by a neighbor who saw him loading guns into his truck for a hunting trip and assumed he was planning something sinister. Another had dealt with a landlord who tried to ban firearms from a rental property, which was illegal in Arizona. "Seems like people see guns and immediately assume the worst," Tom commented. "They watch too many crime shows and forget that millions of Americans own firearms legally and never hurt anyone." "Part of the problem is visibility," another shooter chimed in. "Responsible gun owners like us don't make the news. We go to work, raise our families, enjoy our hobby, and never cause problems. But one crazy person does something terrible, and suddenly all gun owners get painted with that brush?" It was a perspective I'd thought about a lot since my encounter with Deborah. Her assumptions about me had been based entirely on stereotypes and fear rather than any actual evidence. She'd seen a gun safe and jumped to the conclusion that I must be doing something illegal, without knowing anything about me as a person or my legitimate reasons for owning firearms. The educational seminar I'd helped organize at Pleasant Valley Estates seemed like a small step toward addressing that problem. If people understood gun culture better, understood the laws and the safety measures responsible owners took, maybe there'd be fewer incidents like mine. I thought about organizing more events, maybe partnering with local gun rights organizations to offer free safety courses for the community. But I was also cautious about becoming too identified as the gun guy. I had other interests and other aspects to my personality. I didn't want firearms to define me or my role in the neighborhood. Balance was important. I could be an advocate for Second Amendment rights and responsible gun ownership without making it my entire identity. That middle ground felt right. As the one-year anniversary of the ATF visit approached, I reflected on how much had changed. The incident that had seemed like such a crisis at the time had ultimately led to positive outcomes. The HOA was better run, the community was more educated about firearms, I'd made good friends like Tom, and I'd learned valuable lessons about standing up for my rights through proper legal channels. I'd also learned about the importance of staying calm under pressure. When Agent Rodriguez had showed up at my door with Deborah standing there triumphantly, I could have panicked or gotten angry. Instead, I'd stayed composed, cooperated fully, and let the facts speak for themselves. That approach had served me well throughout the entire situation. Marcus Chen, my attorney, called me one afternoon to check in and see how things were going. We'd stayed in touch even after the case was resolved, occasionally grabbing lunch to discuss legal topics or just catch up. "You ever think about what you'd do differently if you could go back?" he asked. "Honestly, not much. Maybe I would have read the HOA bylaws more carefully before I bought the house, looked for red flags about how the association was run. But once things started with Deborah, I think I handled it about as well as I could have." "You were a model client. You documented everything. You didn't do anything stupid like threatening her or escalating the situation, and you trusted the legal process. I wish all my clients were that level-headed." "I had good guidance. I wouldn't have known half of what to do without your advice. That's what lawyers are for. But you'd be surprised how many people don't follow that advice. They let their emotions take over and make things worse for themselves." We talked for a while longer about other cases he was working on, other HOA disputes that ranged from petty to absurd. Apparently, my case had become somewhat famous in Arizona real estate law circles, used as an example of HOA overreach and the importance of following actual bylaws rather than personal agendas. "You're in a case study now," Marcus informed me with amusement. "I presented on your case at a continuing legal education seminar last month. Changed your name, of course, but the facts are all there. Other attorneys found it fascinating, especially the part about the fabricated bylaws. Happy to contribute to legal education, I guess, though I'd rather not be famous for this." "Too late. You're a cautionary tale for overbearing HOA presidents and an inspiration for homeowners who refuse to be bullied. That's not a bad legacy." After we hung up, I thought about the concept of legacy. I'd never imagined that buying a gun safe would lead to any of this, becoming a small landmark case in HOA law, helping reform my community's governance, or teaching people about responsible gun ownership. Life was strange that way, how small decisions or incidents could ripple out into larger impacts. I was grateful it had worked out well. Things could have gone very differently if Agent Rodriguez had been less professional, if Marcus had been a less competent attorney, if the HOA board had been more supportive of Deborah's actions. I'd gotten lucky in a lot of ways, even though I'd also made my own luck by handling things properly. The gun safe still sat in my spare room, heavy and secure, protecting my firearms and valuables. Every time I opened it to retrieve a gun for a range trip or to add ammunition, I thought about the absurd journey that safe had triggered. 800 pounds of steel and security features, and it had somehow become the catalyst for federal investigations, lawsuits, criminal convictions, and community reform. I'd told the story so many times now that it had become almost routine, but I never lost sight of the underlying principles. Property rights matter. Constitutional rights matter. Standing up to abuse of authority matters. Those weren't abstract concepts from civics class. They were real protections that required real people to defend them when challenged. Tom sometimes joked that I should write a book about the experience. Title it something dramatic like The Gun Safe Incident or How I Sued My HOA and Won. I laughed off the suggestion, but part of me wondered if there was value in sharing the full story more widely. Not for fame or recognition, but because other people were probably dealing with similar situations and could benefit from knowing how I'd navigated mine. Maybe someday I'd write it all down, every detail from Deborah's first threatening letter to her conviction to the positive changes in Pleasant Valley Estates. It could be a resource for other homeowners facing HOA harassment, a guide for staying calm and following proper legal procedures, and a reminder that standing up for your rights was worth the effort. For now, though, I was content with my quiet life in Scottsdale. I worked my remote software engineering job, spent weekends shooting with friends, attended occasional HOA meetings to help keep things running smoothly, and enjoyed the peace of knowing I'd defended my principles and won. The Arizona sun set over Pleasant Valley Estates every evening in spectacular displays of color, painting the desert sky in ways that never got old. I'd sit on my back patio with a cold drink, looking out at the community that had been through so much drama and come out better for it, and feel genuinely content. My gun safe was just a gun safe, doing its job protecting firearms and valuables. The ATF had moved on to investigating actual criminals. Deborah Patterson had moved away to start over somewhere else, hopefully having learned from her mistakes. The HOA was functioning properly under reasonable leadership. And I was just Blake Owens again, a regular guy living in a nice neighborhood, no longer defined by conflict or controversy. That was exactly how I wanted it. Sometimes the best ending to a dramatic story was everything returning to normal, to the peaceful, boring routine of everyday life. I'd had enough excitement with the HOA situation to last me a lifetime. I thought about potential future challenges because there would always be something. Maybe a new neighbor would complain about something, or the HOA would propose a new rule I disagreed with, or some other conflict would arise. But I felt prepared now, experienced in handling disputes through proper channels and confident in my rights as a homeowner and citizen. The lessons from the gun safe incident would stick with me forever. Read contracts and bylaws carefully, document everything, stay calm under pressure, get good legal advice, stand firm on principles, but stay open to reasonable compromise. And most importantly, don't let anyone bully you into giving up your rights, no matter how official their title or how threatening their letters. Those lessons applied far beyond HOA disputes. They were principles for navigating all kinds of conflicts and challenges in life. I was actually grateful, in a weird way, that the situation with Deborah had happened. It had tested me and taught me, and ultimately made me more confident in myself. As I sat on my patio that evening, watching another gorgeous Arizona sunset, I raised my glass in a silent toast to the 800-pound gun safe sitting in my spare room. It had been worth every penny, not just for the security it provided, but for everything else it had inadvertently taught me about standing up for myself. Tomorrow I'd wake up, log into work, write some code, maybe hit the gym, probably check the HOA community forum to see if there were any issues that needed addressing. Normal life, peaceful life, exactly what I'd wanted when I moved to Pleasant Valley Estates a year and a half ago. The gun safe incident was over, resolved completely, with all the right people winning and all the right lessons learned. It was a satisfying ending to an absurd situation, and I was ready to move forward into whatever came next, confident that I could handle it with the same level-headed approach that had served me so well. Life in Pleasant Valley Estates continued peacefully, and that was more than enough for me. And